Hello friends, the Bourbon Nerd here. Welcome to lesson 5 in my bourbon school. Today I'm going to talk about malting and malted barley. And to support me in this lesson, I am sipping on an American single malt, seems appropriate, from Westwood out of Oregon. You should definitely try these guys out if you want to try an American single malt. So before we get started, cheers y'all. Nice. All right, let's get started. So before I actually get started, just a really quick recap from the previous lesson. So I just want to reiterate why on earth we even need this malting. And as you may recall, once you crush the kernels of the corn or the barley or the rye or the wheat, whatever you're going to use for your whiskey, it contains a lot of starch, and starch are really large complex molecules that the yeast cells, which is used for fermentation, cannot really consume. So we need something to break down those starch molecules into individual glucose molecules, which in fact is sugar, right? And as we discussed in the previous lesson, there is this enzyme called amylase that will do exactly that in a couple of hours. And amylase is exactly why you do malting, because the malting process produces the amylase, so you don't have to find other ways to do this. So when I'm going to talk about now the malting process and what malted barley is, just remember the whole purpose of this is to find these enzymes that break down the starch molecules into glucose so the fermentation can get started. All right. And if we look into the basic process here about malting, is there are really 4 steps, whereas the last one is optional. The first thing is called steeping, and it's basically a way to soak the grains that you're using, cereal grains that is, with water so that the moisture increases. Then there's something called germination, where you really allow the grains to develop a little sprout. The third phase is something called kilning, which in fact is the reverse. You're trying to stop the germination process by drying it again. So you're sort of back to square one, if you will, of course, with a little sprout. And then there's this optional step. I'm going to explain that in the very last part of this video, roasting. And you can think maybe it's like roasting coffee beans. You can get special flavors out of this process. All right, let's get started with the actual steeping. It's really easy. You basically take a lot of grains, primarily barley. I will explain why barley is the most predominant grain here at the end. You just soak it with water, literally. First you rinse it and then you soak it over a couple of days. And then the moisture content increases from 12-15-ish to probably in the vicinity of 45 to 50% moisture. So quite a lot. So that takes a little while. So once you've done that, you go to the next process, which is basically germination. And there's a cross section here of a barley seed. The area there to the very far right is actually not really red. It's just for clarification here. This is where it's sort of the sprout is sort of hidden inside, and the large white area here is basically starch. So when these grains start to germinate and develop this little sprout, that sprout will actually use that starch to convert that, because this amylase is being developed in the process to convert that starch a little bit into sugar, right? And as you can see here, what it looks like, this is after like 2 to 5 days. I talked to some manufacturers, they have different approaches. Some do 3, 4, or 5 days. Some even do a couple of days, it depending a little bit on the humidity and I guess temperature in the area that they do there. But you've probably seen this before. This can happen with any kind of seeds in nature. Once it gets moisture and the right weather conditions are there, they will start developing this little sprout. And of course, in this little sprout, this is where the amylase is. So this is a wonder of nature. And at one point, people figured out this is actually what happened, right? On the germination, you can do that, of course, if it's home style, you can just do it on a little plate or whatever. But manufacturers, they have very different approaches to this. So the picture I have on here is sort of like when you do a lot of things in hand, you do it on the floor. You do this special equipment where they sort of churn over all the seeds, so make sure it's been oxidized, and in that way it's not only get oxygen, but also it keeps it helps keeping the moisture sort of even, if you will, right? So once you get to the right level of germination, and that's up to the manufacturer when they think enough is enough, then as I said in the beginning, you sort of stop that process again by something called kilning. And kilning is basically you take the very wet and very moist sprouted seeds and dry them. And as you can see in the picture, this is from an industrial plant, obviously. There are different approaches to this. This one here, it's a little bit difficult to see in the picture though. It has some ventilations or holes in the floor where they sort of ventilate this with really, really hot air. Not too hot though, because you don't want to kill the enzymes, but you want to get some hot air in there. So you basically, just like a hair dryer, you dry the seeds in that way. And this will reduce the moisture level to approximately 5%, which is actually lower than when you started. So this is really, really, really dry. So this is one approach here. There's another approach, and I'm actually going to cover that in my next lesson, because you could also choose to dry the seeds with smoke. And they do that a lot in other places in the world, not so much in the US, but predominantly, of course, in Scotland, where they dry the seeds with smoke, sometimes with the smoke from peat, hence the name peated whiskey and peat. But I'm going to cover all of that in the next lesson as well. So that's a different approach. And once you've done that, you could decide to take some of the seeds and do a roasting. And as you can see here in the picture here, there are different colors. And of course, the more you roast the grains, just like with coffee beans, the darker they get and the more flavor you get out of it. For this one here, it's not really for use with enzymes to get the amylase, because in fact, when you heat up enzymes to a certain level, the enzymes die. So if you want to also do roasting a little bit of your malted grains, it's primarily for flavor. In fact, I do have one bottle here. It's from Woodford Reserve. It is chocolate malted rye. It is a bourbon, but they used malted rye and roasted them quite a bit, and that's called chocolate rye. And it has nothing to do with the color, because as you probably recall from one of the very first lessons, is that all whiskey ends up completely transparent. So all the color here actually comes from the barrel, but the sort of the scent you get from the roasting is definitely there. It's an interesting product for sure. All right. Cool. So I said in the beginning, malted barley, and there are alternatives to malted barley. So just to sum up, malting is a process where you take any cereal grain, soak them in water, let them germinate to develop a sprout, stop them in their tracks by actually killing them by drying them up. And then you have this amylase that you put into your mash, and then all the starch is converted into glucose, so you can start the fermentation. And the barley seeds are probably the cereal grain that is most effective at this. And there are places in the world, for instance, Scotland, where, especially single malt, of course, where you can only use malted barley. You cannot use any other grains. So that's why the manufacturers often, also in the US, primarily used malted barley for this. But there are alternatives, and I'm going to show you 3 alternatives here. One alternative is malted corn. Yes, you can actually malt corn. It's very, very difficult. There's not a lot of manufacturers that can pull it off. And I haven't tried a malted corn product myself. As you can see here on the screen, there's a couple of manufacturers. So one called Low Gap, and the other one is called Revelations, that dabbled with this malted corn. So they can make a single malt corn whiskey, or just a normal bourbon where they just added malted corn instead of malted barley. But it's a little bit unusual. More usual, though, is when you do malted rye. You can see I have a couple of examples here from Cedar Creek and Chattanooga whiskey. I tried several whiskey products also from outside the US where they used malted rye. Great products. I really, really like them. They are not as effective as producing amylase as malted barley, but these manufacturers have probably gone the little extra mile to make sure that they wanted to do this. So maybe if you come across this, you should definitely try it out. And then as a last alternative, and this may sound bad, but it's not too bad, there is of course the option to use commercially available enzymes. If you go down this path, you don't have to do any of the malting process at all. You can just buy these commercial enzymes, which of course for a whiskey manufacturer will not come in these small bottles here, but maybe in big buckets. It will do exactly the same. Enzymes, all enzymes by the way, when they get to a certain temperature, they will evaporate, so nothing stays in the whiskey, so this is not bad for you, and it's perfectly okay. And as you may recall from one of the previous lessons, when you get into the distillation process, the temperature gets really, really high. So all the enzymes that you used in the manufacturing process early on, they will completely disappear when you do the distillation. I've talked to a couple of manufacturers that use this routinely. They also do it to maybe top off on their malted barley. There's a little bit of, I wouldn't say debate, but some people say that commercially available enzyme doesn't give that malted, taste or nose that you are really looking for if you want to go down this path. But you could absolutely legally do this for sure. Okay, so that was it. So malting is actually pretty easy. So again, it is just to create this enzyme so you can convert the starch into sugar, which is glucose. And then before we end, there's just one more. I just want to give heads up for my next lesson, because as I said, sort of midway into this video here, this thing about kilning or drying the seeds with smoke, especially smoke from peat, is a really, really big topic. So in the next level, I'll be covering what peat is and what the peating process is. And that will also cover the explanation why especially Scotch whiskey, especially Scotch peated whiskey, and for instance bourbon smells and taste so differently, despite the fact that they're almost created in the same way. So I hope you're going to join me for that lesson. And until then, thank you for listening and watching. Cheers!